This is the third presentation in my series on defending Australia. Please note this is a reload as the original presentation had problems with its sound. This one is about Australia's strategy and defence forces with the implementation of the Defence Strategic Review. The Defence Strategic Review has established Australia's strategic policy till at least 2050. Its implementation involved little public discussion, nor was there any real attempt to explain what it actually means for the ADF. The Defence Strategic Review was commissioned when the new Albanese government took office. Its authors were His Excellency Professor the Honourable Stephen Smith and former Chief of the Defence Force Sir Angus Houston. To save time, I'll just refer to it as the DSR. The DSR was announced in a joint media release by the Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence on the same day. No further media releases were made by either the Minister, the Prime Minister, nor the Defence Department calling for public submissions. The deadline for public submissions closed just 88 days later. Public submissions, depending on preference and security concerns, are usually made public, but not on this occasion. You can actually get some submissions from the bodies that made those submissions who have listed them themselves. You just have to do some searching for that. It is not hard to believe that the time frame left submissions with organisations and businesses in the know. The extraordinary short time frame for submissions, plus the lack of community engagement by the Minister, left the general public out of the process. The DSR was then released in April 2023. It changed the ADF from a balanced force to one based on denial. Its recommendations on the Australian Army were already implemented later that same year, even before any recommendations on the Royal Australian Navy were developed, let alone before the Army received any of the recommended missile systems or even its replacement infantry fighting vehicles. Let me clearly state my opinion right at the start so that I am honest with regards to my bias. The DSR is an appalling document that will have a disastrous impact upon Australian defence and strategic policy for decades to come. I critique the entire concept of denial in my book, The Long March to Defeat. If Australia ever needs to rely upon its defence force in this form, then the philosophy behind the DSR is that of a glorious defeat. At best it will be subjugation, at worst it will mean ruins and relics. Let's start with an interesting example. Any Australian defence strategy with regards to China is obviously about deterrence. In the DSR, it is referred to as deterrence and resilience. The first critical issue listed under resilience is an informed public. Apart from a few industry talkfests, let me ask you, when was the last time you heard of any politician from any party holding a public discussion on Australian defence policy, either in their electorate or elsewhere? Or if you've heard the Defence Department organise any public discussion anywhere at all. So much for the lead critical issue. Bluntly, the report was also incomplete. A significant omission was that the sections on the structure of the Royal Australian Navy and maritime policy were completely missing. It is difficult to understand how you can develop a coherent continental defence policy without finalising the maritime component. One of the more interesting omissions is in the government response. An absolute key element of the DSR is the development of the RAAF's bear bases in the north. It recommends their hardening, especially fuel storage, and on-site security and air defence. The government's response to these recommendations was agreement in principle, pending the 2024 National Defence Strategy. A year after the adoption of the DSR, the RAAF bear bases remain unprotected and consist of nothing more than barren airfields. The government, since this presentation, has put in seed money for the upgrade, but the bulk of the money has still not been put in the budget. As it is unlikely construction will commence in 2025, and that's more than 2 years after the DSR was implemented. One of the biggest omissions is also the most frightening. Hugh White is one of Australia's leading strategists. This is Hugh White's book that was published in 2019. The DSR is based entirely on the theories he developed. Bluntly, the DSR is White's strategy. Ignoring his scathing criticisms of the DSR, what is interesting is that, having adopted White's policy of denial, the DSR simply fails to explain why the force structure is substantially less than what White recommended. Let's get to the specifics. This is the number of fighter aircrafts, F-35, Super Hornets and Growlers, Australia currently has in the RAAF. It will not increase under the DSR. At the bottom is the number of AUKUS submarines the RAN is forecast to have by sometime in the 2040s. Now on the right is how many extra fighter aircraft and submarines were recommended by White in order for his strategy of denial to succeed. In other words, we have less than half what is required under White's strategy of denial. It's not that the authors of the DSR had to embrace White's theories in their entirety. It is just that, having adopted his strategy of denial, they needed to explain why the DSR could do so with less than half that recommended by White. They completely failed to do so. So let me discuss the DSR, and you can decide for yourself if you agree, either in full or in part. Under the DSR, there are now 4 pillars to Australian defence policy. The original 3 pillars are simply reworded, but remain controlling the air and maritime approaches to Australia, ensuring an adversary does not obtain bases in countries to our north, and the alliance with America. In the DSR, the latter now morphed into our traditional allies, so that Britain is now included. The 4th pillar is a little different. The DSR states that Australia's Army must be transformed and optimised for littoral manoeuvre operations by sea, land and air from Australia, and have enhanced long-range fire capabilities. It then states the Army will include a single combined arms brigade able to meet the most demanding land challenges in our region. In reality, this means a gutting of the Australian Army. It will lose 2/3 of its ground combat forces. Instead of potentially 3 combined armed brigades, it will now only have 1 based in Townsville. This means Australia will never have the capability of repeating our intervention in Timor. It will never again, whether you agreed with them or not, undertake combat deployments such as Iraq or Afghanistan. The Army will be stretched to maintain even limited deployments, such as the decade-long rebuilding of the failed states of the Solomon Islands, or the incredible mine clearance and support for democratic reforms in Cambodia, or medical support in Rwanda, and repeat deployments to Papua New Guinea. When the Army is ordered to do minor deployments, which it will, the burden will completely fall on the men and women of the Special Forces. It's not just that the Army is losing 2 combined arms brigades, turning them into little more than weak light infantry units. This means it is also reducing or cancelling entirely the recruitment and training, plus a number of infantry fighting vehicles, mobile artillery, and attack helicopters needed to equip and maintain 3 brigades. Even if Australia decides to expand its army in the future, it will simply not have the equipment for the additional brigades and very quickly will not have the trained NCOs to make them effective. What the ADF is getting is lots of missiles, sometime in the future, perhaps, maybe. The Navy is getting the Tomahawk, the Army is getting 42 HIMARS. It is the HIMARS that, somehow, is envisaged to provide the Army's firepower to deny any maritime assault or raid against Australia. The authors appeared to have completely ignored geographic scale. The HIMARS have a range of around 500 kilometres, slightly less with the advanced targeting systems needed for attacking warships. If the bulk of this enhanced firepower is located at the main Army base at Townsville and there is an assault at Darwin, then they can absolutely devastate a whole bunch of sand dunes nearly a third of the way there. If it is amassed at Darwin and the landing is at Broome in Western Australia, then they can blow the hell out of the local feral camel population. If they are based at Broome and a Chinese naval force is more than 500 kilometres out to sea, then they can kill a whole lot of dugongs. It's not that the HIMARS are a flawed weapon system. It is just that the philosophy behind their introduction is flawed, leaving it as just a relatively pointless procurement. As part of the DSR, the RAAF's bare bases across northern Australia are at the moment to be hardened to accommodate the forward movement of attack aircraft from their bases in the southeast. That, plus the Army only having one brigade, is the reason Australia is dramatically expanding its transport capabilities. Yet, until the RAAF is in place, these bases become a tremendous strategic risk that needs managing, but the Army no longer has the force to provide that protection. The DSR solves this problem by simply stating the defence of their bare bases is now reliant not upon the regular Army, but upon the Army Reserve. Here is the first problem. Draw a line from Perth to the far north of Queensland, and above it there are 3 lightly armed surveillance units with at most 500 soldiers in each, but probably much less. A recent Audit Office review severely criticised the entire reserve's training and stated strength. At best, the number of trained reservists in Australia stand at about 8,000, spread right across the continent, but overwhelmingly below that line. In order to protect the bare bases, the major reserve units will need to be collected and airlifted upwards of 4,000 kilometres to defend sites in terrain that they have never trained in, within command structures that have never existed in the field. The DSR has to deal with a tremendous reduction in the Army's combat strength. It did this by looking at the map and redesigning Army organisational charts. As seen, one example was the need to use the Army Reserves to justify the gutting of the regular Army. The other was redefining the concept of littoral combat. In the conventional sense, this means operating in coastal waters with an emphasis on amphibious operations. The DSR expanded this concept to now include operating within Australia. There is no longer any attempt at continental defence. One way to look at it is to think of places like the bare bases, or RAAF Tyndall, Cairns, or even Darwin, as islands in the sea that is Australia. Theoretically, these islands will become the base to launch aircraft or missiles against any force that threatens Australia. That is, provided we have time to establish our own base, and provided that the Chinese will do what we want. General Moreland, in his book Danger on Our Doorstep, called the Australian Army, of which he was justifiably intensely proud, a one-shot wonder. He did so because even then it lacked the reserves that it needed to survive high-intensity combat for any reasonable length of time. The Army, now, has completely lost the reserves that he believed wasn't enough. This means that, in the face of any heavy combat, the Australian Army will almost immediately cease to exist. Now, there are different concepts or philosophies regarding how to defend Australia. One is Hugh White's clearly stated in his book. Theoretically, the DSR adopted White's concepts, but completely failed to understand how he applied them. Then there is Paul Dibb's old concept of the balanced force. It too was flawed, but his concept saw Australia through half a century of deployments, of which those who served should look back upon with pride. That defence force is gone with the adoption of the DSR. Others, such as mine, look at it completely differently. In the end, the DSR does not address geography or specifically state how this new structure will deter China. You can't help getting the feeling that the tremendous cost of the new AUKUS submarines has led to dramatic cost cuttings. Therefore, the DSR is, at best, a procurement plan. At worst, it may not even succeed at getting the desired weaponry, but that's another story. I hope you are finding this series interesting, and it's going to continue further down the path. Here's a list of recommended readings for those interested in the topic. The list includes books I have previously mentioned in this section, but there is also the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It publishes consistently strong analysis on defence issues facing Australia. Anybody interested in Australian defence policy should register for their free newsletter, podcasts and online presentations. Since this presentation was made, they've also found another very, very good website called Strategic Analysis Australia. You should, if you're interested in this topic, definitely sign up to their newsletters, and they have podcasts as well. Okay, thank you.